Our first presenter on this panel is Christopher Cameron, who is Associate Professor of History at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. His research and teaching interests are in African American and early American history, especially abolitionist thought, liberal religion, and secularism. Professor Cameron's first book, To Plead Our Own Cause, African Americans in Massachusetts and the Making of the Anti-Slavery Movement, was published by Kent State University Press in 2014. Professor Cameron is also the founding president of the African American Intellectual History Society, a scholarly organization founded in 2014 to foster dialogue about research, writing, and teaching in Black thought and culture. This is a growing and thriving subfield in the American historical profession, in no small part thanks to the efforts of Professor Cameron and the society itself. Professor Cameron's presentation today is titled Liberal Religion and American Politics, From Abolitionism to Black Lives Matter. Our second presenter will be Kevin Dindolk, who serves as the Paul B. Henry Chair of Political Science at Calvin College, right here in Grand Rapids. Professor Dindolk also serves as director of the Henry Institute for the Study of Christianity and Politics. He is the co-author or co-editor of several books, as well as numerous articles, chapters, and other pieces. Professor Dindolk also serves on the board of the Michigan Center for Civic Education. The title of his presentation is Religion and the Challenge of Pluralism in American Public Life. Our third presenter is Emma Greene, who is currently a staff writer for The Atlantic, where she previously served as managing editor for TheAtlantic.com. Emma graduated with a degree in government from Georgetown University, where she was also a George F. Baker Scholar. Her presentation today is titled The God Beat: How Faiths Are Constructed, Deconstructed, and Represented by the Media. Last but not least is Amy Kittelstrom, Associate Professor of History at Sonoma State University in California. Professor Kittelstrom specializes in the study of modern American thinkers and their local and transnational contexts. She's particularly interested in the lived intellectual connections between individuals and cultures of the past. Her first book, The Religion of Democracy: Sovereign Liberals and the American Moral Tradition, was published by Penguin Press in 2015. Professor Kittelstrom also serves on the editorial board of the Journal of American History. Her presentation today is titled Liberal Opposition: Cosmopolitan Conscience at the Turn of the 20th Century and Today. And with that, I'll turn things over to Chris Cameron.
All right, good morning. I appreciate you all being here today and look forward to sharing some of my work with you. This presentation draws from a book I'm working on entitled Liberal Religion and Slavery in Early America, although some of what I'll mention towards the end speaks to concerns in a book I'm completing on African American secular thought. The title of my talk is Liberal Religion and American Politics: From Abolitionism to Black Lives Matter. While there are a number of liberal sects I could discuss, I'm going to focus on the Unitarians and Universalists in my discussion of the 19th century and the Unitarian Universalists when talking about modern America. William Ellery Channing, the man widely known as one of the founders of Unitarianism, emerged in the 1830s as an important figure in the abolitionist movement, although he continually denied that he was indeed an abolitionist. From 1835 to 1842, Channing published 8 books or tracts on the issue of slavery, including Slavery in 1835, Emancipation in 1840, and The Duty of the Free States in 1842. Channing also spoke against slavery and the ways it limits free speech and press in Faneuil Hall in Boston, and he led a petition drive to Congress. So he claimed not to be an abolitionist and never did join a society, but his other activities were similar to and even surpassed those of many self-professed abolitionists. Perhaps more important than this work, however, was his influence on abolitionists such as Lydia Maria Child, Samuel May Jr., James Freeman Clarke, and others, as well as the fact that his voice helped lend the movement an air of legitimacy that was lacking from the dominance of, quote, babes, sucklings, obscure men, silly women, publicans, and sinners, in the words of Samuel Joseph May. Channing's ideology in some important respects was very similar to the Garrisonians, or the followers of William Lloyd Garrison. He argued that slavery was inconsistent with God's moral law, degraded both the master and the slave, was sinful, and constituted the chief stain on American republicanism. He also believed strongly in the necessity of nonviolent means in ending slavery and rejected the colonization movement that would end slavery very gradually over decades by repatriating African Americans to Africa. Unitarians would be pretty divided on the issue of slavery up until the Civil War. The same latitudinarianism that made them eschew theological conflicts with the Orthodox also made many loath to engage in debates with Southerners over slavery. Also, Unitarians of the 19th century tended to be among the economic elite and thus were generally more politically conservative. So from the 1830s through the 1860s, there was always a tension between political conservatism on one hand and Unitarian notions of the perfectibility and spiritual equality of all people. Universalists in the North were probably more supportive of anti-slavery than Unitarians, but as a whole, the denomination was still pretty divided. Edwin Chapin emerged in the 1830s and 40s as one prominent Universalist reformer. He was the pastor of the Independent Christian Church in Richmond, Virginia in the late 1830s, and then a Universalist church in Charlestown, Massachusetts from 1840 to 1845. After that, he moved to assist Jose Abalu at the Second Universalist Church in Boston, but his preaching on reform issues, including abolitionism, temperance, and capital punishment, alienated many people, and he left after a couple of years. But during his time at the Second Universalist Church, he played an important role in helping to establish the Universalist General Reform Association, which was an organization aimed at coordinating the various reform activities of the denomination and at being something of a moderate contrast to the radical Garrisonians. In March 1842, Chapin delivered the ordination sermon at the First Universalist Church of Providence, where Henry Bacon was being installed as pastor. The sermon was a reflection on the duties of liberal Christians, where he noted, "It is not the chief business of liberal Christians to preach mere dogmas. It is their least business, to reform men, to ameliorate their condition, to cause them to know and be reconciled to God. This is the great labor laid upon us." This sort of speaks to the tension between social conservatism and desire for benevolent reform present among both Unitarians and Universalists. The man for whom Chapin was preaching his ordination sermon, Henry Bacon, had been a Universalist minister in Haverhill and Marblehead, Massachusetts, before moving on to the Providence congregation. In September of 1845, the day after the General Convention of Universalists was held in Boston, Bacon organized a mass meeting where a committee was appointed to prepare a protest against slavery by Universalist clergymen. The protest was sent to every Universalist minister in the country, and by April 1846, 306 out of roughly 700 Universalist ministers across the country had signed the protest. The protest included 9 points. Some were arguments about turning men into property, stealing labor, and the right of Northern ministers to preach against sins in the South. But the key issues they raised were significant for Universalists in particular and liberal religion more broadly, including the argument that slavery diminishes the moral and intellectual powers and thus does not allow for that self-culture and understanding of natural theology so critical to both Unitarians and Universalists. They also noted that slavery presents an insurmountable barrier to the propagation of the great truth of universal brotherhood and thereby most effectually prevents the progress of true Christianity. Under its broad shadow, Universalism cannot grow. This argument was nothing new. As far back as 1773, Samuel Hopkins had argued that the slave trade hurt the cause of Christianity in Africa, and many since his time had made similar claims. What is important about it, however, is that it represents something of a reversal of the position of Universalists towards slavery during much of the early 19th century, where the desire to spread universalism as much as possible meant that ministers explicitly ignored controversial or political issues. But now, for at least 306 Universalist ministers, getting involved in the anti-slavery movement represented an opportunity to bring slaves and free blacks into their denomination. Not all Northern Universalists agreed with the protest, of course, and they were urged to send their reasons for not signing it to the main journal of the denomination, the Trumpet and Universalist magazine. Benjamin Whitmore, Universalist minister, did so in February 1846 and gave as his first reason, "I cannot sign it as a Universalist clergyman because slavery has become a political party question, and as a clergyman, I know no political party." Universalists, when they did get involved in the movement, often avoided the national societies. Of some 600 officers of the 4 national abolition societies between 1833 and 1864, only 2 are known to have been Universalists. So I want to step back for a moment and explore sort of the broader relationship between liberal theology and the politics of slavery. Now, in regards to slavery, Unitarians generally believe that any reform movement which sought to impose a solution through coercive legislation or some other outside force was doomed to failure, since such action would do nothing to change the hearts of the individuals most affected and would limit itself to dealing with symptoms rather than causes of evil. Unitarians formed a Christian humanist philosophy that rejected the notion of cruelty, whether administered by divine or human hand. Their writings served as a primary source for abolitionist arguments about the inherent brutality of slavery. In fact, Lydia Maria Child's 1833 An Appeal in Favor of That Class of Americans Called Africans would become a classic example of the suffering slave genre. The transition from a punitive to a benevolent God in Unitarian theology advanced a reinterpretation of human pain, and the anti-slavery movement would also draw from this reading. Additionally, the rise of organized philanthropy among Unitarians was related to the decline of the sacramental functions of the church. With fellowship open to all and no distinction in who can take communion, some churches felt they needed to sort of develop new corporate identities. And philanthropy for them was also related to self-culture, as the opportunity for generous giving enabled the well-to-do to cultivate their moral powers. And William Ellery Channing, in an 1838 tract, defined self-culture as the care which every man owes to himself to the unfolding and protecting and perfecting of his nature. Channing's liberal theology and approach to interpreting the Bible, articulated in his famous Baltimore sermon of 1819, likewise provided a foundation for abolitionist readings of the Bible and arguments throughout the antebellum period. For Samuel Joseph May and others, Unitarianism affirmed humanity's essential goodness and led true believers into reform movements that would promote that goodness. The Universalists had called for the abolition of slavery at their first national convention in 1790, citing their belief in salvation for all as the motivating factor. However, they rejected any mechanisms to enforce this ban on the church's membership, hoping that temperate appeals to the conscience of slaveholders would bring about an end to slavery. This is sort of a common theme among both denominations, as they would sort of much rather change people's hearts by appealing to their moral sense than forcing laws on them. During the period of the Universalists' greatest growth, from 1800 to 1840, Universalists generally stayed aloof from the abolitionist movement, and one reason was their theology. They simply disagreed with the contention of many abolitionists that slavery was a personal sin, and instead described it as a social sin. Also, many abolitionists demanded that churches expel slaveholders, which for the Universalists was dismissed as totally foreign to the denomination's tolerant practice of open communion for all. So for the Universalists, what we see early on is theological considerations actually keeping them on the outskirts of the movement up until roughly the 1840s. The Universalist Church of America and the American Unitarian Association merged in 1961 to form the current Unitarian Universalist Association. Soon after they did so, they faced what has come to be known as the empowerment controversy. In 1963, two white Unitarian Universalists, Viola Luzo and Reverend James Reeb, were killed by white supremacists in Alabama, which drew national attention and helped with the passage of the Voting Rights Act a couple of years later. This is generally considered the high-water mark of UU participation in civil rights. Over the next couple of years, the denomination was roiled by internal dissension, with black members accusing the leadership of ignoring their concerns or being paternalistic. Many of these individuals formed the Black Unitarian Universalist Caucus to lobby for funds for the denomination directed specifically at racial justice. The executive committee of the UUA initially agreed to do so, but had to lessen the offer, leading to most members of the BUUC leaving the denomination and forming the Black Humanist Fellowship. Fast forward about 50 years, and there's now a similar situation facing the Unitarian Universalists. In the wake of multiple police shootings of unarmed Black people across the country, the denomination formally came out in support of the Black Lives Matter movement in 2015, with resolutions that called, quote, member congregations to action to become closer to a just world community and to prevent future incidents of this nature, as well as another one urging member congregations to engage in intentional learning spaces to organize for racial justice with recognition of the interconnected nature of racism, coupled with systems of oppression that impact people based on class, gender identity, sexual orientation, ability, and language. These ideas are great in theory, but many African American members feel the denomination can do more, especially in addressing the lack of diversity within the denomination. There are very few Black UU preachers and leaders in the denomination, and what recently began as a hiring controversy that overlooked candidates of color has led to a full-scale calling out of white supremacy within the structure of the faith. Many Black members, including one of my colleagues at UNC Charlotte, Dr. Zakia Amin, have formed Black Lives UU to increase the visibility of Blacks within the denomination and to push the faith to be more responsive to issues of racial justice, both within the UUA and in the larger American society. It remains to be seen what effect this will have, but many are hopeful that the formation of Black Lives UU can push the denomination to take a larger role in struggles for both racial and gender equality. Thank you.
Well, good morning. We're going to go a very different direction now, but I think it's going to be very fruitful later to have a conversation, in part because of some of the comparisons and contrasts we can make. I also, in my title for today, left it very broad so that I could get very specific and gave myself a little flexibility to explore some different topics. So here we go. The banner headline about religion in the 2016 presidential election jumped out from the exit polls. 8 in 10 white evangelical voters reported Republican candidate Donald Trump as their choice. A few months on, political scientists like me have nuanced that number with a little better data. But no amount of analysis will challenge the basic fact that white evangelicals reprised their role in 2016 as a reliable bloc in the Republican coalition. While white evangelical voters were uneasy with Trump in the primaries when they gave their strongest support to candidates with clearer conservative bona fides, the evangelical rank and file eventually found their way back to the familiar rut in the two-track road of American polarization. I want to reflect briefly today on the reality of that polarization, especially for white evangelicals, and to use their example to say even fewer words about American religion and civic culture more generally. But first, let me define some terms. Term one, white evangelicals. I won't be talking about white evangelicals strictly in a cognitive way, as if they're merely walking bundles of beliefs. Yes, their beliefs about Jesus and salvation and about the authority of Scripture, evangelistic outreach, these kinds of beliefs matter to who they are, but those beliefs are channeled through social practices and memberships. So my definition of a white evangelical generally starts with a person's affiliation with particular churches and those churches' denominational umbrellas. It matters not simply that someone believes in salvation by grace alone or biblical inerrancy, but also that they profess those doctrines in the midst of Southern Baptists and not United Methodists or Catholics. It also matters that they profess those doctrines in churches that are predominantly white. This focus on beliefs, practices, and affiliation is a standard strategy for social scientists, though not an uncontroversial one. And we could talk some more about that in question and answer. Term 2, polarization. For those of you who were here last night, you might recall that that term wasn't given a whole lot of love. But I should clarify up front how I'm using it. I won't be talking about polarization as simple divisions along ideological or policy lines, progressive versus conservative, pro-life versus pro-choice. Nor will I talk about mere party self-identification, whether voters say they're Republican or Democratic or what. I'll talk about partisanship in more elemental terms, as partisan identity. The idea is that just as we encounter other markers of identity, such as gender or race, partisanship reinforces assumptions about the groups we belong to and those we don't, assumptions that we rarely articulate and might not even realize we have. And these assumptions can carry a lot of emotional and intellectual weight. Study after study shows that the most ardent partisans see their opponents as not merely wrong, but untrustworthy, morally suspect, maybe even a danger, an existential threat to the body politic. What's more, the magnitude of these extreme evaluations exceeds even highly charged social divides over race. It seems there are very few things that are more tribal and divisive than partisan attachments. I should also add that polarization is not necessarily about two poles, right versus left. We can be polarized in multiple ways. Even so, in American political practice, we are often left with something like bipolarity, in large measure because we have a two-party system, which we didn't really discuss much last night. And parties have incentives to flatten diversity and channel our choices in ways that are easier to manage and mobilize. So, to be clear, not all white evangelicals are polarized. Still, there's much to say about those who are. And I'm a Protestant, so I'm open to both revelation and three-point sermons. So I want to focus today on just 3 revelations about the polarization of white evangelical voters in the 2016 election. So here's the first revelation. White evangelical polarization trumps Donald Trump. If I were to put the power of white evangelical polarization to the test, I would nominate as the GOP standard bearer a twice-divorced casino owner with a reputation for philandering, who only recently left the Democratic Party and who thinks repentance isn't a big deal. So, the 2016 election, social science thanks you. What did that election reveal? Not only that partisan polarization persists under those very conditions, those conditions of nominating somebody who wouldn't ordinarily resonate with many white evangelicals, but also that partisanship has the potential to reframe how partisans, and in this case, white evangelicals, understand their basic convictions. So a couple things about this revelation. That polarization persisted is not a difficult story to tell, even though I would suggest it's a story that's undertold. We've heard a great deal about how this election was profoundly different in its populist or authoritarian undertones, that it was a historical disruption, unprecedented. Yet in many ways it was ordinary. The story is at least as much about continuity as change. I co-authored a book about the 2008 election titled The Disappearing God Gap ? And our answer to that question was no, that this gap that we see in electoral behavior between different types of groups defined by their level of religiosity persisted in 2008 despite the Obama campaign's best efforts. If I were to ask that question again this year, again I would say no, not really. Again, that the God gap hasn't disappeared. Certainly that 81% of white evangelical voters in the exit polls is not a statistical anomaly. I'm sparing numbers today. I didn't put a bunch of numbers up on the screen. But the fact is, if I were to plot the white evangelical vote over the last 5 presidential election cycles, the line would be largely flat. The exit polls showed 79% of the white evangelical vote for Bush in 2004 and for Romney in 2012. This time it's 81%, really, statistically speaking, no difference. Better surveys suggest slightly different numbers, but a similar pattern, and also a pattern in the gap between different types of voters. So I'm led to believe that most of the banner headlines about the 81% in the wake of the election were really less about continuity than a candidate. The question seemed to be, how could white evangelicals vote for him? But that question assumes white evangelicals were voting primarily for a man rather than out of an identity. The idea of partisanship as identity suggests that we do not rationally weigh our ideological convictions and issue preferences and then choose parties and candidates to suit. It's the reverse. We start with a set of elemental attachments to political groups that become a prism through which we understand political choices. The strength of those attachments might even lead to adaptations in our convictions and our preferences, as this apparently did for white evangelicals, who you may recall they made quite a U-turn in how they assess the importance of presidential character. A few years back, they were saying something very different than they said just before the election in surveys about presidential character. And this works a little bit like loyalties to professional sports teams. Those same fans who thought LeBron James was evil incarnate when he bolted Cleveland for the Miami Heat fully embraced him when he donned a Cavs uniform again, right? Similar kind of, the analogy, I think, to fandom works pretty well in politics. So that's one revelation. Much more to say about that. A second revelation, polarization trumps evangelical elites. We hear a lot from and about Jerry Falwell Jr. and like-minded folk in the election, to the point that it might seem that the evangelical leadership was in lockstep. But the fact is that the election exposed a lot of fracture and conflict among evangelical denominational leaders, parachurch executives, best-selling theologians, megachurch pastors, pundits, media celebrities. The GOP standard-bearer was a lightning rod for a host of deep and long-standing disagreements among evangelical leaders about church-state relations, or about dramatically shifting perspectives on family and marriage and race and other cultural concerns. If those elites were to hold sway over their constituents, we might expect their differences to result in softer support for Trump. Yet, return to Revelation 1. In 2016, we see the same voting patterns as previous elections when elites had greater consensus. We can speculate about the reasons why they seem to have less influence than we might expect. But whatever the background forces at play, I suspect polarization was at the forefront. A third revelation, and this I think is most important and concerning in lots of ways. Polarization trumps civil society. By civil society, I have in mind those voluntary associations and organizations that mediate between individuals and the state and provide a seedbed for good citizenship. Liberalism, classically understood, provides a thin network, a thin framework of process and rights, but the work of building thicker civic dispositions, the necessary social capital of democratic citizenship, falls to the houses of worship and sports leagues, fraternal organizations, and the like that exist outside the state and the market. The problem is polarization is anathema to a healthy and functioning civil society, because by clustering people with others of like mind, it arrests development of the civic skills and dispositions that matter beyond the voting booth. And white evangelicals are a case study of it. They increasingly form their strongest associations with the politically like-minded, even to the point that partisan attachments shape quote-unquote non-political choices like marriage and worship partners. The God gap in American politics is not merely a description of how religion shapes our choices of candidates and parties. The direction of influence can go the other way. that is, to how political identity shapes our lived experience of faith. Indeed, it's one of the reasons we're finding that rising levels of partisanship within evangelicalism is pushing people out of that tradition, which of course simply intensifies partisan identity among those who remain. And that leads me to a concluding thought. All these revelations, that partisanship persisted despite a hard case, that elite opinion didn't filter out to the mass electorate, that polarization erodes civil society, all of those revelations apply not only to evangelicals, but to nearly every other significant religion-defined group, and maybe every social group more generally. My greatest concern is that behind this polarization, we see an erosion in the kind of civic engagement that religious groups have spearheaded, have really fostered throughout American history. Polarization is rooted in a kind of disengagement. That might seem a strange thing to say. We know that the strongest partisans are also the most likely to be voters. They participate, they're engaged in that narrow sense. But in a broader sense, civic republicanism thrives when citizens have the capacity to deliberate with others across lines of difference, real lines of real difference. And religions, quite often unintentionally, but in real ways, have provided some of the most important sites for developing that capacity for deliberation. That only works when they reach out beyond their walls, and polarization tends to keep them inside. On that note, a somewhat pessimistic note, I end. Maybe we could generate some optimism in our conversation. Thank you.
Well, so as the person here to represent the media's job in representing religious groups, I don't know that I actually have that much optimism to bring. I would say that the criticism of the media, particularly in its handling of ideological differences and religious differences, has been loud and nonstop, particularly as we've gone through 2016, past the election, and into these first days and months of the Trump administration. So I'm sorry that I'm not going to be the uplifting speaker to follow that delivery, but I will say that when I was thinking through what I can offer as not an academic but a journalist, to me it's more a role of diagnosis. So looking around at my colleagues, the work that I do, and also the media landscape more generally, and trying to share with you what I see as some of the shoals and challenges that media distinctively faces in trying to understand and document some of the trends that we've already seen from the previous presentations. And likewise, even though this is the Conservative and Progressive Summit, I would place myself conscientiously nowhere on that spectrum, and again, sort of standing back as a reporter trying to understand as a diagnostician rather than as someone who has sort of commitments within either side of the ideological spectrum. So I want to start with an anecdote, an experience that I had at the March for Life this year. This is an annual event, but it took on particular significance after Trump's victory because many who were on the right saw Trump as a defender of the pro-life movement, and particularly because of Mike Pence being someone who has a strong pro-life record and someone who's been committed to that movement. Going there was interesting because it was the exact opposite of the mood that you felt or that I felt being in Democratic or liberal spaces. It was like a pep rally, cheerleading, and everyone was very excited. It was a moment of triumph. And I walked around as I normally do, talking to different people, trying to find different perspectives, and I had an encounter with a man who was probably 50 or 60. He said, I think that he was from Maryland, but he was from out of town, had come into DC, had a Catholic background. And we were talking, and very quickly it turned to, you're only here because Trump won and you lost, and you now have to report on this because Mike Pence is here. You never care about this in previous times, and this is now what America is. We've won, and you're just here because you've recognized that this was something that you didn't attend to in the past. Which I thought was really interesting, not as a moment of confrontation for me personally. I report on the pro-life movement pretty regularly as a religion reporter. but rather that I felt that moment captured a widespread perception on a number of fronts. The first was widespread mistrust of media. The second was a widespread perception that media does not care about nor take seriously the propositions or concerns of conservative movements, and particularly conservative religious movements. And the third is that media is not that fluent in religious concerns more broadly. March for Life, if you've ever been, people joke that you could sort of memorize the rosary even if you weren't a Catholic after being there, because there are so many Catholics, and likewise there are many, many evangelical Protestants who show there, and for many people that's a deep part of their religious conviction. Reporting on the pro-life movement, negligence of the March for Life as a legitimate event to report on, or at least the perception of that, I think is evidence of this sort of gap that exists in the media in terms of what we choose to target and report on and what the context around that is. So with that, I want to turn to the 2016 election and what I perceive to have been some of the shoals and challenges for reporters both before and after, particularly within the religion beat. There was a remarkable interview between Dean Baquet, who's the executive editor of the New York Times, and Terry Gross after the election, when he said forthrightly, the New York Times doesn't get religion. This, of course, caused all religion reporters everywhere to celebrate and think that maybe, just maybe, there would be more hiring spots open for us because we are an embattled group in terms of employment. That has not come to pass yet, but I still hold out hope. But what I thought was remarkable there was he was putting his finger on a suspected cause of why the media so thoroughly missed and mispredicted the outcome of the 2016 election. Something about the Trump voter that the media wasn't able to perceive and pick up on, religious fluency perhaps being the gap there. I don't know that that is necessarily a correct explanatory diagnosis. We've done a lot of reporting at The Atlantic, where I work, about the white working class voter, who is a big overlap with the Trump voter, what causes people within those groups, white working class groups, so non-college educated working in an hourly rather than salaried job, to want to prefer Trump. And there were a couple of factors that we've looked at, especially based on the polling of the Public Religion Research Institute, who we work with quite often. We looked at, in a poll right after the election, the role of institutional fraying and the lack of participation, as Kevin was talking about, in civic institutions and religious organizations. And what we did find was not only are white people in America more generally likely to be disaffiliated from religion, but white working class voters in particular, Trump voters, and especially the young, are more likely to not attend church very often and not even claim any kind of religious identity. One stat that I found to be remarkable from this was that among whites who are college educated versus whites who are working class voters, there was sort of relatively similar levels of non-attendance, but among college educated white people, there was at least the nominal nod to saying I was a Christian or having some sort of affiliation, whereas white working class voters who were under 30, I believe, were nearly half of them did not claim any religion at all. So this is something that we're watching and really interested in, that I do think religion has an explanatory power here, and something that we have been reporting on consistently. But again, coming back to that diagnostic problem, trying to figure out what are the causes of Trump voters wanting to vote for Trump. Another theory that gets floated around that I think can be challenging, particularly for reporters who are not on the religion beat, is the degree to which economic concerns or influence come into people's willingness to vote. This was a big media narrative that came out after the election of Trump, that we had neglected the working class voters who were sad about the decline of coal or the decline of manufacturing in the Midwest or in West Virginia, and we must go out and report on those people and try to actually understand the quote-unquote real America. I think that going to understand different communities in America is always an extremely important reporting activity. I do think that it was a bit of a cliched course correction, and one that actually ended up with more pitfalls than benefits to it. So understanding the degree to which that sort of economic anxiety really is a causal factor, I think is important for reporters, but also reveals in a certain way reporters' biases. This is something that I wrote about recently relative to Elizabeth Warren in Massachusetts. The degree to which her lens for viewing the world is purely about economics. It's understanding people's discontent through their lack of jobs or their railing at Wall Street and the elites, financial elites who run the country. And I think this is a sort of framing bias that many people who are liberal tend to share, some people who are conservative, I think, also share that. But that framing bias then gets ported into the newsroom. And I think that was one reason why we saw this big sort of search for the economic anxiety in the heartland after the Trump voter was identified as someone who needed to be better understood. I also, though, think there are other issues that reporters tend to run up on shoals when they're trying to report on. And this is particularly true in the area of religion or religion-adjacent topics. There are a number of issues that I tend to report on that I say are 1, 2, and 3 neighborhoods away from religion. That includes LGBT issues, abortion, understanding religious denominations, which is more squarely within the religious beat, and also understanding some of the ideological movements that have religious adherents. So people in the alt-right who are religious, people who are on the religious right. And I think in all of these areas, there's a lot of fraughtness in terms of how stories are framed and how reporters approach them. And I think part of that is, again, that there are ideological biases that often dominate newsrooms and that get ported into the way that people approach different issues. I'll just take abortion as one example. There is a language war. You'll notice it if you pay careful attention to the headlines at New York Times, Washington Post, other national publications, about whether to call the pro-life movement the anti-abortion movement or the pro-choice movement, something else that's more about reproductive rights, for example, framing the abortion question in the language of medicalization or rights versus in the language of morality and religion and conscience. Those even small rhetorical tics can often signal not only to readers but also to subjects that reporters are voting on that there's a certain framework that's being brought in as a way of understanding issues that can be very closely held to people of faith. But likewise, and sort of in the other direction, there have been a lot of calls and pressure after the election to report in a way that isn't normalizing, quote, quote, Trump, or that isn't validating the biases of conservatives. This is a call that's come largely from the left, which finds itself very discontent and homeless after being brutally crushed during the 2016 election. And I think this is a double challenge for reporters. On the one hand, taking seriously the concerns of people who are religious, both conservative and liberal religion, but on the other hand, trying to report in what is perceived as an objective way. I don't think that there's any way to fully satisfy this call not to normalize Trump. In fact, I think that's opposite of what we probably need right now in terms of sort of creating democratic discourse. But I do think there's sort of pressure on both sides with that in terms of ideological bias. Kevin sort of stole my thunder on the 81% of white evangelicals who voted for Trump, so I'll only skip through that very quickly. But I do think that in terms of this fraughtness and the places where religion reporters and reporters generally tend to get most tripped up, evangelicals, and white evangelicals in particular, are one of them. In the media, there's this construction of the mythical religious right, which gets held up as a monolith, and as Kevin pointed out, is often thought to sort of use the positions of elites to represent the body whole. And in fact, I think there are many deficiencies in that approach. The first is that there are people who are trotted out in the press again and again and again to be quoted who in fact don't necessarily have clear constituencies or even represent a particularly broad point of view. And some of that I think is being challenged in the Trump era. Just this week, we saw Trump putting out a religious liberty executive order that claimed to be about religious liberty. And the night before, he brought famous evangelicals to the White House to have a dinner in the Blue Room. This was a who's who of the quote-unquote religious right. It was Franklin Graham, who's the son of Billy Graham. It was Jack Graham, who is no relation to the Grahams that I know of, who's a megachurch pastor in Texas. And it was people like Ralph Reed, who's one of my favorite examples of a religious right quotation machine who actually doesn't necessarily have a corresponding constituency. So I think these are all challenges when we're, as reporters, trying to figure out who speaks for evangelicals, being this big group, this politically important group, but ultimately finding deficiencies in those people who are spokespeople. And finally, to take a little bit of a left turn at the end, I just want to touch on religious minorities and the way that those have been treated both in the lead up to the election and in the fallout from the election. One of the topics that we think about a lot in terms of its challenges and its importance is reporting on discrimination. This is something that many people on the left are worried about, but more generally, I think this is a big concern and obligation of reporters to make sure that groups that are marginalized have a voice, that reporters generally want to expose injustices. This is an orientation of the field. And a lot of that focus has understandably been pointed towards Muslims and to some extent Jews in the wake of the 2016 election. This has vexing challenges, though. So we saw this with the wave of bomb threats against JCCs in Jewish communities. There was a lot of concern within Jewish communities about this, and a lot of press criticism that this wasn't getting enough attention, that it was being reported on the wrong way. And in fact, we found out that the 2 people so far who have been arrested, now authorities think they compensate for the entire set of wave of the bomb threats. Neither of them were actually people who seemed to be affiliated with white nationalist groups or neo-Nazi groups. They were 2 different kinds of essentially crazy people who, for whatever reason, had chosen to make bomb threats against JCCs. And this shows how significantly vexed this topic is in reporting, trying to understand and take seriously the concerns of the Jewish community while also not jumping to conclusions or setting up false narratives about the rise of Trump and how Trump has empowered white nationalists, et cetera. Flipping over to Muslims, I think there's a lot of shoals that religion reporters, again, can run up upon in trying to understand Muslims as a minority, and particularly as a minority that's under attack. The data and statistics that come out around discrimination and hate crimes only comes out a year and a half or 2 years after it's actually completed and gathered for the previous year. So we're on a significant lag in actually understanding from an authority what the nature of hate crimes is in the United States, which just sets aside also the sort of difficulty of even reporting hate crimes or gathering reliable data on what that discrimination actually looks like. Meanwhile, we're left to, in that sort of gap of data, we're left to use incidents and anecdotes and people's perceptions and the way that they describe themselves to make up the middle, to try to construct a sense of what's going on. People are hungry for that information, and rightfully so. But it's difficult because it's not always clear what motivates different kinds of crimes. Arson, for example, is an extremely difficult crime to pin down in terms of motivation, whether it's actually related to religious bias. So this is a challenge that reporters face, again, in trying to answer that desire that people have for information and the desire to report in a way that's objective and constructive, but at the same time not to purvey misinformation or construct false narratives. Finally, I'll close with a perception gap that sort of challenges this entire project that reporters have in terms of the battle from both sides and how people will perceive what they're doing. This was one small statistic from a study that we did with PRRI, or that we reported on from PRRI, that I found to be interesting, which was the perception of discrimination, which groups face a lot of discrimination in the United States. The poll asked different religious groups whether they perceived a high amount of discrimination against Muslims, and then separately a high amount of discrimination against Christians. Most people in the country were likely to say, roughly 2/3 of people were likely to say there's a lot of discrimination against Muslims. About 1/3 said the same of Christians. So it was about a 2-to-1 ratio in understandings of the discrimination against those various groups. White evangelical Protestants, again, this sort of white whale, a distinctive group in terms of its behavior, were very different. 57% of them said that Christians face a lot of discrimination, and only 44% said that Muslims face a lot of discrimination. This is powerful to me, not only in the way that it describes the mentality of a certain group, but also in that it speaks to the unreality or the disjunct in reality that people have in their perceptions of the truth and what's going on. Reporters are often dealing in perceptions and narratives, trying to use concrete incidents and case studies to make a story about the whole or to speak to a broader condition of what's going on in the United States and abroad. And it's very challenging to do that when the perceptions of reality are radically different among different groups, and will ultimately end up with criticisms from both sides in terms of how well reporters are paying attention to various issues or various challenges. That's not, of course, to let reporters off the hook. I am very much up to the challenge, and I enjoy this part of my job. I strive to take seriously the concerns of all groups, and I think ultimately reporters have one of the best tools to do this, which is to be able to listen, to be able to go into communities, seek out different perspectives, find different stories, and tell them in a way that helps other people to understand and empathize the experience of people who are unlike them. I will be very open to both media criticism, feedback, and story ideas during the question and answer time, so please share those.
Hello, everyone. I'm really glad to be here because this concept of common ground is really important to me. So thank you for the invitation. Thank you for being here yourselves. I think that communicating across differences is vitally important and too seldom done. And people retreat into enclaves of the like-minded too much, and then their opinions become rigid, right? My interest in having this kind of dialogue stems from a question that has bothered me since I was a youth, and the question is, how is it possible to sincerely hold a belief and at the same time to sincerely respect someone who holds a different belief? That question has preoccupied me for decades. It drove me to graduate school, where I sought to work on this question not as a philosopher or a theologian, but instead as a historian. So then you have to reformulate, how have people tried to reach out across these lines of difference? And I encountered, my first year of graduate school, an important mentor of mine, James T. Kloppenberg, whose new book on democracy some people may know, and everyone probably should. At that time, he was still working on it, and introduced me, as he did with all his graduates, does with all his graduate students, to pragmatism, the philosophy associated with the figures of William James and John Dewey. And I became really captivated by the thought of James, who was born in 1842, died in 1910, and who I really honestly resented studying because he was such an elite and came from such a upper crusty background that I found myself captivated by his thought sort of against my will, because pragmatism has a kind of provisional answer to my question, provisional being the key word. Pragmatism is about truth, but it's not capital T truth that stands outside of experience, that is fixed and immutable and transcendent, but the lowercase t truth, which is the only kind of truth that's possible for a human being to hold. Human beings being finite, limited by their own perspectives, and not infinite like God. And so the truths that people hold have to be held provisionally, like on hold until or unless another truth comes along and replaces it. So it's truths, not truth. It's beliefs, and beliefs whose value lies in their practical effects. What is their impact on behavior? So you can start having a conversation in that realm despite disagreement, because you have a ground to talk on, and that one is experience, the actual manifestation of these sorts of ideas. And so that provisionality of truths is important, or contingency is a somewhat fancy word for talking about that. And so is perspectivalism, the fact that everyone is imprisoned by their own subjectivity. They can only see anything from the angle they have. Therefore, we need to supplement our own perspectives with the perspective of others in order to get a broader picture of reality. So I went into the research for my dissertation, which became the basis of my book, asking what I thought was a pretty simple question, which was, why was William James so obsessed with religion, and what kind of religion was it that he was obsessed with, given that he was never a Christian? He was not raised Christian, he never converted, he never professed a Christian belief, but he really wanted to protect Christians who did have beliefs, or people of other kind of belief systems, saying, yeah, you can still have beliefs, religious beliefs, despite the fact that it's the modern scientific age. So he devoted a lot of his attention to that, and I went into my research noticing that he had references to Buddhism and Hinduism in a time period I didn't know people in America really knew about those things. I thought I was going to discover the secret origins of pragmatism in the religions of India, which is not actually where pragmatism came from. So that wasn't my finding. Instead, I found that the concern for this way of communicating with one another across lines of difference and the social effect of it wasn't limited to the academic philosophy, pragmatism, but that was actually widely held among James's cohort. Now, he was a Harvard philosopher, so in the wider Boston area, a kind of practical idealism that was interested not so much in systems of belief or dogmas, doctrines, but in ideals that, if held in the mind, practically made a difference in how people conducted themselves, and which had obvious relationships to the progressive movement, the progressive reform movement, in which a sort of post-Christian, practical idealist sensibility was very common, which obviously had a big concern with social justice, and particularly the problem of labor, and which was also cosmopolitan, a word I use somewhat guardedly because it doesn't have to be elite. It's often linked to elitism, but which really signifies an openness and an interest in diverse cultures, diverse texts, diverse ideas, right? So rather than staying in one's own narrow viewpoint. And all of this added up to a religion of democracy. So that phrase, which is the title of my book, is a phrase that William James used, but not only him, other people used this phrase too. It was very common in the time. What is a religion of democracy? Well, first of all, it's a religion that's compatible with other forms of religious belief. So it's not a church of democracy or something like that, that you leave your home church, abandon your home faith to go join. A religion of democracy is instead a creed that holds as its ideal the postulate that every human being has a valuable perspective, that every human being has some inherent kind of sovereignty, sacred worth, and that paying attention to what things look like from their perspective, listening to their points of view, is an essential part of your own individual progress, and then, of course, the progress of a society. So I set out, when I was finished with my dissertation, to turn this work I'd done on the religion of democracy into a book, and so I thought I would go add an antebellum chapter, add a chapter from before the Civil War, which might show the origins of this way of thinking, because it was really obvious to me that it had already existed before William James got involved. And I thought I would find it among the transcendentalists, which was true, but two surprises. One is, not all transcendentalists were post-Christian. There were a lot of Christian transcendentalists. In fact, there were a lot of Trinitarian Christian transcendentalists, so not only the Unitarians that Professor Cameron told us about, but that the belief in a kind of human progress that involves imagination and leaving behind sterile, outdated forms was held among Christians in that time period as well. So that was my first surprise. And then my second surprise was when the bottom dropped out and I found that there was a kind of Christian pragmatism that goes back to the mid-18th century. So even before the American Revolution, in the 1740s and 1750s, as texts from the British Enlightenment, which, by the way, was a Christian Enlightenment, so not the sort of secular Enlightenment of the French that we're somewhat more familiar with, as these texts were coming into New England Christianity, created a new way of talking about religion and thinking about religion that didn't contest any of the core beliefs, at least not right away, but formulated religion as about the duty that human beings hold to grow in likeness to divine perfection. So later, William Ellery Channing, again, Chris Cameron mentioned Channing, called this likeness to God. But in the mid-18th century, it was this idea. God has some characteristics, and we can all argue about the characteristics of God, but one is God must be benevolent, right? Good. God is good. God is infinite, and therefore infinitely diverse, right? Beyond the powers of human comprehension, right? And God is impartial and disinterested. So impartial, not discriminated among people. In order to be good, you can't really be thinking about God as discriminating between people. And disinterested, that doesn't mean bored. It means not self-interested. God can't be doing things for his own gratification, right, in this kind of Christian framework. And I think you can see, if you know something about the American Revolution, how this conception of God dovetailed with the Republican, lowercase r, Republican idea that civic virtue meant acting for the common good, the common welfare, rather than for one's own self-interest. And another idea that comes from this, what I call the American Reformation, when these Enlightenment ideas meet New England Christianity and then spread, is the idea that human beings are moral agents, moral agents. So this links to the idea of free will, which was an old Christian answer to the problem of evil, maybe first formulated by St. Augustine, but that becomes especially potent in the wake of the Protestant Reformation, because when Martin Luther said, "Here I stand, I can do no other, so help me God," he was talking about himself as having a direct relationship with God that superseded his fealty to the formal structures of the Catholic Christian Church, right? And so the free will, which it's necessary for human beings to exercise in order not to be automatons, right? Human beings are not robots. They are instead moral agents whose choices determine, really, their character. So the idea that comes up in the American Reformation is that human beings as moral agents must continually exercise their powers of choice in order to grow toward the ideal of divine perfection, disinterest, impartiality, benevolence. But then when it comes to the infinite part, humans can only do that in community with one another, in cooperation with one another, taking in diverse perspectives. Okay, so this concept of moral agency also operated in light of this notion of conscience. So conscience is what Martin Luther was claiming when he took his stand. And so when the Puritans migrated to New England, they made liberty of conscience one of their most important articles of their community. Now, we think wrongly of the Puritans as autocratic and so on. And I would just recommend the book by David Hall, A Reforming People, as a place to contest any accretions of this kind of prejudice in your minds. In fact, the Puritans really earnestly tried to work out their idea of the godly community. There was not an orthodox theology that all Puritans shared. Instead, from the very beginning of the settlement, they argued with one another all the time over how should you interpret the Bible? What's the right understanding of this? Right? So each congregation around its minister, which is why it's the Congregationalist church, not the Puritan church, would have these arguments and so on. And it's on this idea of liberty of conscience, conscience being a faculty of the divine held within, so that everyone bears an inborn chip of the divine and has to be faithful to that in order to grow in their moral agency. Okay, so that is all in the atmosphere around the time of the American Revolution, and John Addams is very much a part of this. John Addams, whom conservatives like to claim as one of their own, but could not possibly have been a conservative because he was a revolutionary. He wanted to overthrow the existing order, and he wanted to do that in order for more people to be able to live out this idea of moral agency. Okay, so the manifestation of this rolls through the beginning of Unitarianism and Transcendentalism, anti-slavery, the Common School movement, all on the same kind of concept of liberating people so that they could exercise this moral agency. Abraham Lincoln, whom Professor McClay mentioned this morning, also studied the works of William Ellery Channing very closely in his self-education. Okay, so the overall idea linked with transcendentalists, especially of independent-mindedness or nonconformity, is instead of conforming to the crowd, you need to stay faithful to this inner conscience that's yours and only yours, and keep growing then in dialogue with others. Okay, so this brings us to the turn of the 20th century that I promised in the title of my talk. And so Jane Addams is the figure I want to use here. She recently was the subject of an op-ed piece by David Brooks in the New York Times, which was very disappointing to me because he used a bad biography of Addams to try to construct a picture of a woman he clearly didn't understand. Okay, so briefly, she worked in the reform community around Chicago, ministering, I want to use that word, to the immigrant laborers of such diverse nationalities in the neighborhood around Hull House in Chicago. She became so important that every president from Roosevelt to Roosevelt took her advice and knew her personally. Right? She was the first American woman to win the Nobel Peace Prize, and she was consistent with this idea of independent-mindedness, so that when she went to an evangelical college, she would not want to become an evangelical and coerce others, in her view, to believing that kind of system, but instead was deliberately inclusive in all of the operations in Hull House, which required her to go in between different groups. So the diverse immigrants in her neighborhood, the college-educated volunteers at Hull House, the businessmen in the community whose money she wanted, right? The politicians she wanted to convince to end child labor and these kinds of things. The academics she brought in for these conversations at Hull House, socialists, right, radicals. She had conversations with all of them, and this was consistent with her idea of democracy, her religion of democracy, which William James, after reading a book of hers, Democracy and Social Ethics, said, you are actually practicing what I claim to believe, this religion of democracy, because she says you need to take all of these viewpoints into consideration in order to get change. We can only move forward together, right, by taking in all of these viewpoints and pursuing the democratic purpose, which she said involves the self-expression of every individual. So again, that self-culture idea that Professor Cameron alerted us to earlier. She ultimately became involved in anti-imperialism and pro-peace movements, which characterized the last decades of her life. So anti-imperialism comes up around the Spanish-American War of 1898, when the United States very quickly defeats Spain, and then has the question of what to do about Spain's colonial possessions. Cuba, they nominally let go, but the Philippines, the United States decided to keep, despite the fact that Filipinos did not want to be kept, which resulted in a war of subjugation and the violation of their rights. So the anti-imperialist movement in the United States, you can't call strictly liberal, right? There were people who didn't want the Philippines as colonies because the people were brown-skinned. There were people who didn't want the Philippines as colonies because they were far away, people who wanted to be isolationist. But Jane Addams, William James, Mark Twain, and many others opposed imperialism on democratic grounds, saying those people too should have the right to self-determination. So this is how liberalism, which had been a sort of establishment view in New England across the 19th century, became a power of opposition. Okay, so I'm just going to read a little bit from William James's address of 1903 on the Philippine question, at which point he recognized that the anti-imperialists were never going to make a difference, that he says the word anti-imperialists suggests a thin-haired being just waked up from the day before yesterday, brandishing the Declaration of Independence excitedly and shrieking after a railroad train thundering toward its destination to turn upon its tracks and come back. The United States was not coming back. It was going to keep going down that track. And so James said that we need then to fight for intellectual life, the critical conscience that believes in educational methods and in rational rules of right. So this is what he called liberalism at that time, and urged upon his audience to continue the good fight, but now in an international way. So he says the older liberalism was in office, the new is in opposition. he says that American thinkers then need to join the great international and cosmopolitan liberal party, the party of conscience and intelligence the world over, so that these people could pursue their, quote, campaign for truth and fair dealing until the end of time. Truth and fair dealing were values that he claimed as liberal values. And I would ask, urgently ask, whether truth and fair dealing can in any way be said to be conservative values, given what the House of Representatives did yesterday. And there are a lot of other things I could mention, right? Truth seems to be jeopardized these days. So in closing, then, the remedy that I would suggest might be for all of us engaged in conversation, pursuing some kind of common ground, which we hope will lead to common good, might be to listen to the poet William Wordsworth, the British romantic, who was really involved in the development of this whole religion of democracy. Channing met him in England before Wordsworth's death. Well, actually, Channing died first, but in any case, so there's this poem. I'm just going to read the end of this poem for you. And it's called Lines Left Upon a Seat on a Yew Tree, which I know isn't the catchiest title. But this poem was so beloved by Americans in the 19th century that they could often just recite bits of it and expect their audience to know what they were talking about. Right? It was sort of a lingua franca in 19th century America, and it started among those Unitarians that called themselves liberal Christians, this love of Wordsworth and romantic poetry. But it spread by the end of the 19th century to Methodists, Catholics. I have lots of sources showing the love of Wordsworth and so suggesting that this could be a unifying concept. Because the whole reason that the liberal Christians wanted open-minded, inclusive communities was so that they could grow in moral virtue, was so that they could become better people, which meant that they were aware of sin. Right? So I just suggest this in closing then as a frame of mind that might be useful for us. So the end of this poem, stranger, henceforth be warned and know that pride, however disguised in its own majesty, is littleness, that he who feels contempt for any living thing hath faculties which he has never used, that thought with him is in its infancy. The man whose eye is ever on himself doth look on one, the least of nature's works, one who might move, the wise man, to that scorn which wisdom holds unlawful ever. O be wiser thou, instructed that true knowledge leads to love. True dignity abides with him alone who, in the silent hour of inward thought, can still suspect and still revere himself in lowliness of heart. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you for these papers. I think one of the lingering questions I have that probably Chris Cameron put on the table, but perhaps is for all of you. I keep thinking about, or wondering about the meaning of the phrase white evangelical. And specifically, trying to understand, not just descriptively, right, which I imagine there are people who believe themselves to be white and evangelicals, but analytically, what sort of work that phrase and that framework for your work is doing. Chris only alludes to, I think, perhaps how troubled, right, or the trouble that's underneath that phrase. But I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit. And then, Emma Greene, I wondered if you were slipping between evangelicals and white evangelicals in your comments and whether that's important to come back to and clarify. So thank you all again.
May me to start with this one?
Sure.
Very good question. Thank you for asking that, because you know, we're not going to settle you know, a variety of questions around how race cuts across designations like evangelical. We're not going to settle that here this morning, but we at least have to get some clarity on it, I think. If I were to do a survey and ask a set of belief questions, questions about who Jesus is, about salvation, about authority of Scripture, and that sort of thing, and just use that as a basis for determining who an evangelical was, you would find that, in fact, lots of African Americans would embrace the same ways of answering those questions as lots of others, including lots of white folks too. So part of what I'm talking about, and one of the reasons I defined white evangelical in the way I did, was to say that you can't possibly talk about these groupings without understanding their social underpinnings, that they just can't be belief measures. So that means, you know, looking at how people live out their faith in networks, in these different types of groups. And when you do that, I'm a political scientist, so I'm interested in the political implications of these kinds of analytical categories. When you do that, the differences are so remarkably stark that it throws right in your face, as a social scientist, a set of questions about what's going on in the, you know, underneath. So what can we say about that? I think there's a few things that I would just mention briefly. You know, if we look at sort of the history of evangelicalism in general, and then sort of break out African-American Protestants and white evangelicals over the last 30 years, part of the history, you could tell the history, certainly of white evangelicals, in terms of a response to racial conflict, and especially in the South. And so the rise of white evangelicalism as we understand it today, one school of thought will suggest that this was partly a response to the tumult, the racial tumult of the 1960s, and especially to desegregation and changes in variety of policies in the South. I think there's a great deal to that story to tell. One of the challenges, I think, in telling the story entirely in that way, is that it focuses a great deal on what's happening in the South. And you might have noticed that in the way I'm using white evangelical today, it's also encompassing evangelicals across regions who may have very, very different kinds of experiences of their faith. So, you know, it's going to include the way I categorize today, it's going to include members of a denomination that's prominent around here, the Christian Reformed Church, but it's also going to include Southern Baptists and members of the Assembly of God and so forth. And so that's I would say a tension and a problem in a lot of ways in the definition as I used it. But in any case, you can certainly tell, given the size, the scale of Southern Baptist Convention, Assemblies of God, and so forth, you can certainly tell the story of white evangelicalism in part as a response to that history in the 1960s and before, of course. So that's a piece of it. I think we can also look at certain ways of understanding marriage and family. That's another kind of school of thought, trying to understand where white evangelicalism comes from and how it's distinguished from other forms of Protestantism. And so that's just a way of sort of laying out some of the analytical categories. There's a whole lot more to think about in the context of race, but and how it cuts across these categories. It's just you sometimes, when I think about it and try to look at numbers related to this, it becomes nearly impossible to disentangle. It is impossible to disentangle race from religion and just sort of belief measures, in part because of that history.
So I guess to address the slippage, certainly for me in this context, I think that's more the result of tumbling through verbiage across 15 minutes rather than a lack of thinking that's a serious categorical difference, because certainly when that much touted stat came out after the election, 81% of white evangelicals, was starting to get passed around. That's something that we gave a lot of thought to. How do we explore the white part of white evangelicals? And I think with reporting the shifts after the election, this has been on my mind, which is among people who might be considered co-religionists, either by being within the same church, denominational structure, or more broadly within the same big genre category of Christianity or another denomination, or another, religious group. In what way is there fracture that's been especially exacerbated along racial lines because of Trump, and because people do feel even more acutely than they perhaps did previously the difference between sort of their concerns as a racially specific group within a religious context compared to their white co-religionists. So that's something that I would just say we pay a lot of attention to and that I take really seriously. I'll just add as one sort of sidebar to that. One thing I've been paying attention to is the language that people are using to refer to themselves, particularly post-Trump. And of course, the 2016 election is a constructed marker point. On the one hand, it was a seismic event in the history of the United States. On the other hand, it was just like every other election. And on the other hand, many of the things that have fallen out post-Trump were in fact in gestation before we got to November. So, I'm using that as sort of shorthand. But I have noticed, especially among younger cohorts, people who perhaps are from a more diverse background in terms of national origin, immigrant status, or racial affiliation, this sort of reaction to the term evangelical as a political category rather than as any kind of religious descriptor. And I think there's a lot of power in that. I don't know that you could call that a trend or something that perhaps has firm boundaries around it, but I do think there's a growing perception that the term evangelical is as much a descriptor of certain value commitments where you stand in a political spectrum, certain orientations towards culture, and not just about your theological beliefs or the denomination that you belong to. And I think that friction is being felt generationally, and I think it's also felt racially. Black people feeling like the term evangelical does not belong to them precisely because the 81% of white evangelicals who voted for Donald Trump feel like people who they can't relate to or don't recognize. So certainly I pay a lot of attention to that, and I think that's a really important thing to draw concern to.
One thing I would just add about how, in fact, the way we handle polling might reinforce the very perception that you just described. And so when you think about the exit polls and how those tried to measure white evangelicals, the question essentially asks people, are you evangelical or born again? And then determines whether you're white or black, and it gets reported as white evangelicals, right? Now, some people who may have self-identified as white or as evangelical or born again, which, by the way, we know it includes lots of Catholics. It includes others as well, who we might not ordinarily think of as evangelical. But when you add the descriptor, white evangelical, and that gets associated with a particular way of understanding politics, then you might have some people who otherwise would have accepted the term evangelical start to recoil from it. One of the things that's going to be interesting for me as a social scientist going forward is to what extent we're starting to see changes in the types of people who show up in that white evangelical category, precisely because lots of other folks may decide I'm no longer going to accept the term, even if they accept the underlying beliefs and values. So that, I think we're going to have to wait another couple of years, maybe 4 years, to really get a sense of what that's like, because 2016 was a special test case of the potency of this term of evangelical.
If I could just jump in on this question, it's not my own field of research, but 2 weeks ago I was at a similar event where Professor Randall Balmer was a speaker also, and he specializes in this history, spoke on this very topic. And so just a couple clarifying remarks. First of all, segregation wasn't only a Southern problem, but a nationwide problem, was and is a nationwide problem. And the white evangelical response to Brown v. Board of Education was to create segregation academies that were, that were under a sort of religious heading. Oh, this is a religious school, but it was actually a school for white children to not have to go to school with black children. And this goes all the way up to Bob Jones University when it loses its tax-exempt status because it actively discriminates on the basis of race. This is that case is a later in the line from the 1971 case I wrote down here, Greene versus Connolly, which says no, segregation academies the current issue, in fact, of the nonprofit status of religious organizations, or can they do political work, right? This is all part of that history, and Balmer says that the issue of abortion comes after this, that actually the white evangelical political movement coheres around trying to defend the rights of these segregation academies, and then later they find the wedge issue of abortion. So just a little addition.
Hi, my name is Paul Murphy. I'm the GVSU History Department. So I think the idea of perspectivalism, the idea that we're all locked into our perspectives, seems to be a very convincing idea now with the thought bubble idea of the internet, social media. So I'm thinking specifically of your talk, Kevin, is in describing this 80% vote, is it an evangelical identity, or is it a conservative identity, or a Republican identity? Because things I picked up suggest that the big polarization is party identification. Like they're the people only marrying each other, right? Or maybe that's not possible to know. Another kind of maybe related question is, one bit of common ground I've been struck with is the common ground between Catholics and Protestants. And when I was studying the Southern conservatives, I knew a Southern conservative who converted to Catholicism, and he said it was like it was the whore of Babylon, right? And he had this very profound sense of being Southern and going over that other direction. But now it doesn't seem like such a big deal to me, or maybe I'm missing something. And so I thought it was a fascinating panel. I just thought I'd ask those kind of questions.
Well, I didn't bring statistics, but one of the things I mentioned, I want to reiterate it here just to take care, is that white evangelicalism is a somewhat more diverse entity than what I described, right? And so if we're thinking about, if we're thinking about white evangelicalism in terms of your question, is it about partisan identification? By the way, you use that term, and I get a little itchy about it because that's usually a kind of self-ID. I'm a Republican or a Democrat. The way I was talking about it was to say, well, this is a kind of identity that people might have even if they don't want to claim identification with the Republican or Democratic Party. But there is a sizable proportion, I'll put it that way, of white evangelicals who you would say have appropriated that partisan identification. This is probably most closely associated with people that we often say are members of the Christian right. Although even there we have to be careful because not all evangelicals are members of the Christian right and not all members of the Christian right are evangelicals. But that is a particular conservative movement that develops, as Randall puts it, as Randall tells a story out of the racial conflict of the 1960s and before, and then of course there are other tellings of the story, but whatever story you tell, you have this movement in the late 70s and into the 80s and perhaps as early as the late 1960s of a conservative movement into state and national politics. So that is, depending, there are lots of different ways of trying to figure out, well, who fits in the movement? Who's a movement activist? But I would say that there's a high correlation between those folks who would be a part of that movement and evangelicals who have this kind of partisan identity. Then there are other evangelicals who are, perhaps because of their religious faith and perhaps just because they're Americans, who are disconnected entirely from politics. We're talking about 81% of evangelical voters, white evangelical voters. That leaves out, depending on the election, anywhere from 40 to 80%, right? If we're talking about midterm elections, of people who are not turning out to vote or participating in other ways. And so we might want to suggest that those folks are a little, they haven't been captured by this kind of partisan identity. And then there are lots of other categories in between. So that's just a way of suggesting there's an enormous amount of diversity here, and I don't want to leave the impression by saying that polarized white evangelical Protestants revealed this and that in the election, that all of these white evangelicals are polarized, let alone any other religious groups.
I noticed a common thread between all four of your presentations where you were discussing religion and specifically evangelism, but one of the things that wasn't really discussed was the relationship between evangelism and revivalist religious movements, particularly because a revivalist religious movement does the two things where it gives people self-identity and it also gives them purpose. These are very powerful things. And this is one of the major disconnects right now in politics, is that we have a group of people who are making an argument and another group of people who are not listening to argument but only experience. This is why Abraham Lincoln's oration was so powerful, because he was one of the few orators who could simultaneously appeal to people's sense of experience or belief, as well as someone's sense of intellectual rigor and argument. But we have a huge body of people in this country on both sides, because Bernie Sanders was very strongly supported by the millennials who were more strongly reached through an appeal of belief and an appeal of experience rather than an appeal of argument. And so how do you think that that kind of fits into this? And this goes in with the abolitionist movement, because the abolitionist movement was really the forefather of human rights on a global scale. And interestingly enough, as much as it is a movement of argument, it only really achieved its goals because it became a movement of experience. As people witnessed the effects of slavery, they became then propelled with purpose to engage in the abolitionist movement. For the first 150 years, it was an argumentative movement that really didn't get much traction outside of English intellectual circles. I'm going way back in abolitionist history here. But English intellectual circles, and even when the founding of the Republic, when it was kept as an argument, it didn't really get out there. But once it became an experience, then it kind of transformed things. And so I'm interested in everyone's sort of opinion or perspective on that.
Well, I think you're exactly right with the kind of ties between evangelism and revivalism, especially for the early 19th century. And one of the sort of interesting connections I'm finding in my own research is the sort of the ties between evangelicals and Unitarians during the 1820s and 1830s, especially Charles Grandison Finney's notion of perfectionism and the way that it maybe influenced William Ellery Channing's ideas of self-culture and the perfectibility of human beings. So yeah, I definitely think there's kind of really significant ties there that would play a role in many liberal Christians during the 1830s and 1840s sort of embracing abolitionism. Of course, not a majority of them. I would say of ministers, probably no more than 20 to 25% of ministers sort of openly came out in support of the movement, but certainly more than a lot of other sects at the time.
So I'll jump in. I would contest the framing of the question a little bit, which one of the things that you included was this idea that there's one side, presumably conservatives, who make arguments based on reason and logic and facts, and then another side, presumably liberals, although I may be putting words in your mouth, but that's sort of what I read into the question.
Because the Bernie Sanders
Bernie
support
Sanders
was really,
millennials.
yeah, this
Right,
is
right,
not
right.
this is not a political thing as much as it seems to be more of people's intellectual attitude towards decision-making and
Yeah.
policy.
Okay, so we can use the Bernie Sanders leftist, fine. Or you could say, you know, identity politics leftist, whatever, that those people are basing their political arguments on experience. I would contest that because I think actually there are both of those things on both sides. So, you know, within a liberal or leftist tradition, you could say that there are many, many arguments based on, you know, years of accumulated facts about, you know, race-based discrimination and, you know, the efficacy of having different types of economic benefits or whatever. And then also that there's this feeling of identity and experience within the culture being this really powerful driving force. I think similarly on the right, there, you know, is a lot of logic around the type of arguments that people are making, this primacy that's put on sort of reason and discourse and the ability of the realm of ideas to be the place where we sort of duke things out. But at the same time, you know, there's a deep fixation on being able to say Merry Christmas at the, you know, department store, and people feeling that they're under attack and that they're being marginalized as a culture that's really alive on the conservative side of the spectrum, or at least within certain subcultures. So I would say that all of that is to say that experience and argument, I think, are common across all peoples and cultures and ideologies. And when that comes to religion, there's sort of an analog sort of in thinking about the difference between belief and practice, and it's a both and. In trying to understand what's going on, you can't just listen to the words that people are saying or the rational arguments that they're levying, but you also have to look at the formation of their communities, how they talk to each other, the language that they use, the cultural context. And all of that, of course, makes things infinitely interesting because there are multiple ways and angles that you can come at trying to understand what's going on in culture.
So experience is a key word in my talk, partly because it was a key concept for liberal Christians and then post-Christian liberals. Of course, the title of William James's most influential book is The Varieties of Religious Experience, where he's expressly arguing that it's only in people's actual experience of religious feelings that it becomes really alive. He wouldn't have it just be one born-again experience. One specific like hallmark experience, but an ongoing unfolding of experience. And so two things I just want to add here. One is in the growing movement, Black Lives Matter as the sort of banner organization, but growing movement among Americans, white Americans, wanting to understand how to be allies to African Americans who are subject to so many forms of brutalization at the hands of police and others. So how can I be a better ally? And learning about it maybe through social media. Well, one of the best ways would be to actually have relationships with people from outside your own racial group, right? Experience then being the grounds of understanding. That's a sort of premise of pragmatism, really, that experience is where you get understanding. And then the other thing I would point to is the English thinker John Stuart Mill, who I think is very appropriate for this common ground discussion because he's claimed by both conservatives and progressives as a forebear. He, of course, would call himself a liberal in the context of 19th century Great Britain and wanting to expand the right to vote, but he didn't want to expand it all the way to universal suffrage, although he did favor women's rights. And so in his On Liberty, this short book that he composed with the help of his wife, he said that we have a marketplace of ideas, and they need to contest one another, even for those ideas to be alive. And so he looked back to the example of the early Christians, which Jane Addams also liked to use the example of the early Christians. The early Christians were fighting for their belief in a diverse religious world in which they were a minority. And in doing so, they practiced, reputedly, really practiced, very conspicuous ethics of Christian brotherhood, service to one another, these kinds of things. And so Mill's contention is that once a belief becomes widely accepted and becomes dogma and becomes just the thing that everybody thinks is true, it loses its liveliness. And that so it's in the experience of ongoing contestation and disagreement that people are able to move toward truth. So I think that is a really important category.
Another round of applause for our speakers.